Earlier this year, Eurostat published data on the average working week across the EU for 2024. Like with most Eurostat releases, no one really noticed, but there was a pretty interesting number in there, 32.1, which is apparently how many hours the average Dutch person works, by far the lowest in the EU, and essentially equivalent to a 4-day week. So in this video, we're going to explain how the Netherlands accidentally moved to a 4-day week, and why it looks like it's working pretty well. Have you ever wondered how much money TLDR makes each year? Or who's funding our journalism? Well, we think transparency is super important. So we answer both questions in our recent video. It's linked in the description. So the first thing to say is that this didn't happen suddenly. Rather, it's the culmination of a long-running trend that apparently started sometime in the mid-80s. Before then, the Dutch were about as likely as anyone else to work part-time, with about 6% of working men and 22% of working women in part-time employment. But by 1990, this figure had risen to 15% for men and 36% for women, and by 1996 it had risen to 16% for men, the highest figure in the OECD, and 38% for women, behind Sweden and the UK, but well above the OECD average. So what happened in the 80s to provoke this shift? Well, broadly speaking, there were two factors at play. First, Dutch unions accepted a reduction in working hours for their membership to cope with the economic downturn that hit Europe in the 70s and early 80s. This wasn't the case in most other European countries, where, generally speaking, unions instead tried to protect as many full-time jobs as they could, even if that meant more redundancies. This was largely because the Dutch economy, and especially Dutch industry, had a particularly rough time in the 70s and early 80s. Quite a lot of this has to do with a phenomenon that's since become known as Dutch disease. In short, the Netherlands began producing and exporting lots of natural gas in the mid-70s, when energy prices were rising worldwide. While this was great news for anyone in the gas industry, it was bad news for anyone employed in basically any other industry. Strong gas exports put upwards pressure on the Dutch currency, the guilder, which made the Netherlands' other exports uncompetitive, leading to widespread bankruptcies and job losses. The Netherlands then suffered a particularly brutal recession in the early 80s, with GDP contracting for 8 consecutive quarters between 1981 and 1983. With exports collapsing and the domestic economy in the doldrums, Dutch unions accepted that they needed to do something drastic. In November 1982, as part of the so-called Visser agreement with Ruud Lubbers' new right-wing government, the unions agreed to both lower wages and accept fewer working hours in order to keep Dutch industry afloat. This worked remarkably well, and in the subsequent economic boom, a lot of the new jobs created were part-time. The second factor was the entrance of women into the Dutch workforce. For a whole load of complicated cultural reasons, women moved into the workforce remarkably late in the Netherlands, but the rise of part-time jobs in the 80s acted as a sort of release valve, allowing women with children or other caring responsibilities to flood into the labour market. The transformation was pretty astonishing. In the 70s, the female labour participation rate in the Netherlands was less than 30%, the lowest in the OECD, but by the 90s it had risen to over 50%, well above the OECD average. You get the idea. The Dutch shift to part-time work apparently began in the 80s, with both a supply-side element, in other words, a rise in part-time job creation after the unions accepted a reduction in working hours, and a demand-side element. In other words, there were lots of unemployed but well-educated Dutch women who were ready for part-time work. This seemed to work remarkably well. The Dutch economy boomed throughout the 80s and 90s, with strong GDP growth, low unemployment, and balanced budgets. It was at about this time that economists started talking about the Dutch 1.5 earner model to describe households where one partner worked full-time and the other worked part-time. A consensus quickly developed amongst the Dutch political class that this 1.5 earner model was working pretty well, not least because of its dramatic effect on overall employment. And in the 90s, a series of new laws were passed to make it easier for part-time workers. In 1993, a new law extended the minimum wage, which was previously restricted to those working at least 13 hours a week, to all part-time workers. And in 1994, another law obliged employers to include part-time employees in pension schemes. In 1996, the Dutch Parliament passed the Working Hours Act, which included a provision obligating employers to consider the care duties of employees, essentially making it easier for full-time employees to move to part-time work. And in 2000, they passed the Part-Time Employment Act as part of the Framework Work and Care Act, which gave employees the right to change their working hours. Finally, this was updated in 2016 by the Flexible Working Act, which gives employees the right to adjust not just their hours, but also when and where they work. This legislation turbocharged the pre-existing trend towards part-time employment, which is why the Netherlands has had the highest incidence of part-time employment in the developed world for years now. For context, according to World Bank data, in 2023, over 60% of Dutch employees worked part-time, compared to an average of 31% in the OECD and 36% in the EU. Part-time work is still far more common with women, but Dutch men are also still more likely than any of their international peers to work part-time. This is the main reason that, on average, the Dutch work such short weeks, with the latest Eurostat data finding that the average Dutch work week comes in at just 32 hours, the lowest in the EU by quite some distance, and well below the EU average of 36 hours. Of course, this number is brought down by all the part-time workers. It doesn't mean, for instance, that everyone is working 4 8-hour days, but as part-time work has become ever more popular in the Netherlands, 4-day weeks have indeed become very common. So, how's this working out for them? Well, to be honest, it looks like it's going pretty great. The Netherlands has a remarkably high employment rate. According to OECD data, 82% of working-age people in the Netherlands were in employment at the end of 2024, compared with 75% in the UK and 69% in France. Nor does this seem to have hurt the Dutch economy. The Netherlands is an incredibly rich country, measured by GDP per capita, largely because Dutch workers are quite literally some of the most productive in the world, which might have something to do with the fact that they're not as burnt out as the rest of us. And finally, families seem to appreciate it. Dutch kids are quite literally the happiest in the world, presumably at least in part because they get to spend more time with their parents. Now, when you're diving into complicated topics such as this, it's quite easy to get caught up in what you know without even missing a beat. But what about the stories you don't see? Or what happens when the stories you do see are purposefully leaving out information to try and sway your thinking? Thankfully, our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at helping with just that. Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles from around the world and puts them all in one place for you to easily compare how news is being covered by different outlets online. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting on it, as well as the political bias, factuality, and ownership of said sources. For example, if we take this story on Australian unions pushing for a 4-day work week, you can see that there are 19 sources reporting on it, with 5 of them coming from the left and 7 of them coming from the right. You can even compare the headlines to see what either side is saying, with the left focusing on the purported productivity advantages to a 4-day week, while the right focused on the need for realistic expectations. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of super handy features. Our personal favourite is their blind spot feed. Here you can find stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, helping you challenge your perspective on someone else's media reality. Here at TLDR, we're passionate about helping you understand how bias may affect the media you consume, something Ground News also firmly believes in. Because of this, we're offering 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. You can only access this discount through our link, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.